All right, get ready for a deep dive, everybody. Today, it's the story behind the 2018 Lion Air Flight 610 crash and the Boeing 737 MAX 8.
Buckle up.
Yeah, seriously. We've got some intense source material here. We're talking corporate pressure. We're talking cost cutting. We've even got a chilling quote from a Boeing engineer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the engineer straight up said, someone's going to have to die before Boeing changes things.
Wow. And you know what's really striking about this whole story is that it's not just like one single event, it's like a chain reaction,
Yep.
choices made over years and years that all kind of snowballed.
Domino effect.
Exact. And it all builds up to this, well, catastrophic outcome.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock back to 2012. Boeing's working on this new plane, the 737 MAX 8. They want to compete with Airbus, right?
Right.
Got to have better fuel efficiency. So they decide, okay, let's install these bigger, more fuel-efficient engines.
Sounds good so far.
But there's a catch.
Always has.
These engines, they had to be placed further forward, higher up on the wings.
And that right there, that placement, that's the first domino. See, it changes the whole aerodynamics of the plane, makes it prone to tilting upwards, pitching up, especially during high-speed turns.
Imagine you're a passenger. Suddenly the plane's nose is pointing at the sky.
Yeah, not a good feeling.
No kidding. So they know they've got this problem. What do? Back to the drawing board. Redesign the wings.
Well, logically, a tail redesign would have been the thing, counteract those aerodynamic changes,
Makes sense.
But that's expensive, time-consuming. And Boeing, they're under pressure. Got to get this MAX 8 out there fast.
Ah, so what's the quick fix?
Software. They developed this system, MCS, stands for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. Fancy name for basically a software program.
What's it do?
It senses that dangerous upward pitch and pushes the nose down automatically.
Like a software Band-Aid for a hardware problem.
You got it.
But hold on, a software solution like that,
Yeah.
wouldn't pilots need extra training, to handle it if it went haywire?
You'd think, right. But Boeing, they were insistent. Absolutely no need for extra simulator training for the MAX 8.
They said it would just work seamlessly in the background.
Seamlessly, that was the word.
Trying to avoid delays and costs, huh?
Seems like it.
But was everyone on board with this software fix, like internally at Boeing?
Not exactly. Our sources point to Ray Craig. He was Boeing's chief test pilot at the time, and he had some serious concerns.
Well,
During a simulator test, he experienced that pitch problem firsthand. Pushed hard for a hardware solution instead, said, what happens if the software fails? You're stuck with this fundamental aerodynamic issue, and good luck fixing that in the air.
makes you think. What if that software fails mid-flight?
Yeah. And this all happened, by the way, just a few years after another incident that had shaken Boeing pretty badly. The 787 Dreamliner battery fires.
Oh, yeah, I vaguely remember that. What happened there again?
So, 2013, two separate incidents. Battery fires on the Dreamliner. Makes headlines, obviously. And Boeing, under CEO Jim McNerney at the time, they tried to downplay the whole thing.
Damage control.
Big time. Worried about their stock price, the hit to their reputation.
Makes sense, but
Things escalate. And ultimately, you know what? The Transportation Secretary grounds all Dreamliners. No more flying until they figure it out and fix it.
had to be a wake-up call for Boeing. And their relationship with the FAA.
Oh, absolutely. The NTSB investigation later revealed something crazy. An FAA engineer had actually flagged those batteries as a fire hazard earlier on.
Seriously?
Yeah, even suggested a safety enclosure. But guess what? A Boeing rep within the FAA, they dismissed the concern.
So even within the FAA, you have people prioritizing Boeing's interests over safety. That's unsettling.
To say the least, it makes you question the whole oversight thing, How independent was the FAA, really?
And after that Dreamliner mess, Boeing probably wanted to avoid that kind of scrutiny at all costs. Right? Especially with MAX 8.
You bet. They were walking on eggshells with the FAA, knew that any little problem, especially with a critical system like MCS, could mean huge delays, more rigorous certification. They didn't want that.
So they were even more determined to keep any doubts about MCS quiet. But did anyone try to speak up? Like after the Dreamliner incident?
Actually, yeah. In 2014, a young Boeing engineer named Curtis Eubank, he raises his hand. He's worried about MCS relying solely on those angle of attack sensors.
Those are the things that...
Measure the angle of the plane's nose relative to the oncoming air. Important, but notoriously prone to errors, damage.
So a single sensor malfunction.
Could trigger MCS unnecessarily. Eubank gets that and proposes a backup system.
Smart.
Right. But his manager's response, chilling, he says, and I quote, "Someone's going to have to die before Boeing changes things."
Wow. That's a heavy statement. What does that tell you about the culture at Boeing?
I think it speaks volumes. Deadlines, profits, they were king. Potential safety risks, not so much, even when their own engineers were waving red flags.
And sadly, this pattern, it didn't change, even with a change at the top.
New CEO, same priorities.
So in 2015, Dennis Muilenburg takes over. He's an engineer himself.
Yeah,
People were hopeful. Maybe he'd shift the focus back to safety.
right.
Didn't
Yeah.
happen.
Nope. Muhlenberg, good intentions or not, he kept those cost-cutting measures going, eroding that safety culture even further. He was all about staying ahead of Airbus, keeping Boeing on top.
And this all leads up to the crucial moment, getting the MAX 8 certified by the FAA.
The moment of truth.
Boeing had a lot riding on this. They had to get this plane certified, no hiccups.
Absolutely. And they had a plan, a very specific, very calculated strategy for how to handle the FAA. It was all about information overload.
Information overload. That's interesting. But I think we got to save that part of the story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good. We'll pick it up there. Delves into how Boeing's tactics during that whole certification process played their part in this tragedy.
Welcome back, everybody, to our deep dive into what led up to the Lion Air Flight 610 crash. Last time we left off with the FAA certification process for the 737 MAX 8, and if you'll recall, Boeing was in a tight spot. They needed to get this plane certified and fast without triggering any alarms that would make the FAA require extra pilot training. And it looks like they had a pretty, well, clever plan to make that happen.
Yeah, their strategy relied on a guy named Mark Forner. He was on Boeing's flight technical and safety team, and his job was to make sure that the MAX 8 got certified without any snags, especially anything that would lead to mandatory pilot training.
So how did he go about doing that? I mean, did they just try to sweet-talk the FAA into signing off on it?
I don't think charm is quite the right word for it. Their approach was more about just flooding the FAA with so much complex technical information that it was hard to see the forest for the trees. And their main target was Stacy Kleen. She was the FAA representative who was handling the MAX 8 certification.
So it was like a tactic of, overwhelming her with technical jargon.
That's pretty much it. The sources we looked at describe meetings where Forner and his team would present the MAX's flight mechanics in a way that was, well, incredibly dense and difficult to grasp. They knew that Kleen didn't have a super deep engineering background, so they basically bombarded her with charts and graphs and technical terms, hoping she wouldn't get too bogged down in the nitty-gritty details.
So they were kind of banking on the FAA just taking Boeing's word for it without asking too many questions.
You could say that. Forner actually later bragged in a text, and I'm quoting here, about Jedi mind-tricking the FAA. So I guess they felt pretty good about how they'd managed the whole certification process to their advantage.
Wow. Jedi mind tricking. That's a pretty bold statement. It really does highlight how much they were focused on just getting that plane certified ASAP, even if it meant skipping some thorough checks. But okay, even if they did manage to, Jedi mind trick their way through the certification, the plane still had to go through all those rigorous flight tests, right?
Absolutely. And it was during these tests in 2016 that they ran into another issue with the MAX 8. But this time it wasn't just a problem at high speeds, it was happening at low speeds too, like during takeoff.
Hold on, you're saying that even that basic maneuver that every single passenger goes through on every flight was potentially a problem with this plane?
That's right. It turns out that the plane's nose had a tendency to pitch up even at those lower speeds, which meant an increased risk of stalling. Remember, MCAS was initially designed just for the high-speed pitch problem. Well, now they had to expand its activation parameters to cover the low speeds, too.
They were basically just patching a patch, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like the most, robust solution.
That's a valid concern. And this decision had a pretty major unintended consequence. At those lower speeds, MCS would be solely relying on the data from the angle of attack sensors, the same ones that Curtis Eubank had raised a red flag about, the ones that are so prone to errors and malfunctions.
So they made the system even more dependent on the most unreliable part of it. It sounds like they were setting themselves up for disaster. Did anyone raise any concerns about this?
Yes, during a simulator test, a test pilot named Craig Bombin got a very real taste of what could happen if those sensors went haywire. Imagine you're at the controls and suddenly the plane starts diving because a faulty sensor is feeding bad data to MCAS. That's what he had to deal with.
I can only imagine how terrifying that must have been. How did he handle it?
He managed to get the plane back under control by cutting the electronic trim, basically switching off MCAS. But even after that close call, the engineers kind of downplayed the whole thing.
What was their explanation? Why weren't they more worried?
One engineer's take was that the main issue was that, quote, the pilot might fight the MCS input and over time find themselves in a large mistrim. Basically, they assumed pilots would be able to recognize what was happening and override the system if it was acting up.
But during takeoff, wouldn't a large mistrim caused by MSI be disastrous? That's when you have the least margin for error.
Exactly. It was like they were laser focused on just getting the plane certified, and they completely missed the bigger picture. They failed to grasp the potential consequences of a faulty sensor triggering MPES during such a critical phase of flight.
It's like they were just accepting the risk of malfunction, assuming that pilots would always be there to save the day.
It's a risky assumption, especially when you're dealing with a system as critical as MPES. And remember Mark Forner, the guy who bragged about Jedi mind tricking the FAA? Well, he eventually found out about these changes to MPES, this expansion of its activation to cover low speeds.
Wait, you mean they didn't even tell him about this major change to the system?
It seems not, and understandably, he was pretty upset when he found out. He realized that he might have unintentionally misled the FAA during the certification process.
But he didn't speak up.
No.
Why not? Was he afraid? Did he feel like it was already a done deal?
It's hard to say for sure what was going on in his head. Maybe he felt powerless to challenge the decisions that were being made, or maybe he was just caught up in the whole whirlwind of getting this plane out there, convinced that everything would be fine in the end. But whatever the reason, his silence, whether it was intentional or not, had a huge impact on what was about to unfold.
Because just a few months later, in July 2017, the FAA officially certified the MAX 8. And with that, the stage was set for the tragedy that would happen the following year.
That's right. The plane that would later be involved in the Lion Air Flight 610 crash entered service. And it was carrying a hidden danger that had been overlooked and downplayed time and time again.
And so we come to the time right before the crash. Another incident happened that could have been a huge warning sign about the potential dangers of MCS.
Yeah, this next part of the story really shows just how easily crucial information can get lost and how just one oversight can lead to absolutely devastating consequences.
Well, let's get into it. I'm ready to hear the next piece of this puzzle. Let's continue with the events that directly led up to the Lion Air crash in part 3 of our deep dive. Welcome back, everyone. This is the final part of our deep dive into the events leading up to the Lion Air Flight 610 crash. We've been through a lot, haven't we?
We have.
Corporate pressure, cost-cutting, a software fix that seemed doomed from the start. But now we're getting to the heart of it, the months just before the crash, and then, well, the tragedy itself.
And as we go into this, it's really important to remember, there were real people on that flight.
189 lives.
Each one a story cut short. We can't lose sight of that.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the technical details, the corporate decisions, but we can't forget the human cost. So let's talk about those weeks before the crash. I understand there was an incident, a near miss, that could have been a warning.
Yeah, October 2018. A Lion Air captain, he's flying, and suddenly
The plane dives.
starts pitching down, seemingly out of control, very similar to what that test pilot, Craig Bombin, experienced in the simulator.
So MCS acting up again.
Seems like it. And just like Baumann, this captain, he manages to regain control. Cuts the electronic trim, disables MCS. But here's the thing.
What?
The maintenance log for that flight, it didn't fully document the incident.
They didn't record a near disaster? Why not?
It's not clear. Maybe the captain only reported it verbally, thought it was a one-time glitch, or maybe there was a written report, but it got lost somehow. Whatever the reason, it had a devastating impact.
Because no one knew that MCS malfunctioning was a recurring problem.
Exactly. And then, the day before the crash of Flight 610, the plane itself, it has its left angle of attack sensor replaced,
Okay.
but the maintenance crew, they don't test the new sensor.
Why not? Isn't that standard procedure?
You didn't think so, right?
Yeah.
But there was no record of any sensor issues in the log.
So, because of a missing or incomplete log, they sent a plane up with a brand new untested sensor.
A chain of errors. Oversights. A perfect storm brewing.
And on October 29th, 2018, Flight 610 takes off. What happens in those final moments?
The flight starts normally. The pilots, Pavi Sineja and Harvino, they do their pre-flight checks, see some warning lights, things that had come on during the previous flight. But the log says those issues were addressed. No mention of the runaway trim, no mention of a potential sensor problem.
So they had no reason to suspect anything was wrong.
Right. They take off, beautiful morning, no idea of the danger hidden in the plane's systems.
And a minute into the flight.
The captain's control column, it starts vibrating. Alarms go off in the cockpit. MCS reading faulty data from that new untested angle of attack sensor. It's pushing the plane's nose down.
I can't imagine. Do they understand what's happening?
They know something's wrong, but they're trying to figure it out. The captain tries to manually control the stabilizer, fight against MCS. Harvino's desperately searching the handbook, looking for a solution.
Are they talking to air traffic control?
Yes. They report a flight control problem. Air traffic control sees them descending erratically. But no one, not even the pilots, fully grasps what's happening. A malfunctioning software system is fighting them for control.
What happens next?
Chaos. Alarms blaring, the plane bucking. They're trying everything, but MCS, triggered by that faulty sensor, keeps pushing the nose down.
A losing battle.
Tragically, just 11 minutes after takeoff, Lion Air Flight 610 crashes into the Java Sea, 500 miles per hour. All 189 people on board are killed.
It's heartbreaking. A story of missed chances, bad decisions. How does the world react?
It's a shock. The aviation industry, everyone reeling. The investigation, it focuses on the flight data recorder. It paints a chilling picture of the pilots fighting against MCS.
So the data confirmed that MCS caused the crash.
Overwhelmingly, MCS activating again and again, forcing the plane down, all because of that one faulty sensor.
What does Boeing do?
At first, they try to deflect, blame pilot error.
Shift the focus away from their own mistakes.
Seems that way. But as more details about MCS come out, the changes they made, how pilots weren't properly trained, the pressure on Boeing, it builds.
They couldn't deny it anymore.
No. Public outcry. The families of the victims, the aviation community, everyone's demanding answers. The FAA's under fire, too. Their relationship with Boeing, that lacks oversight.
So what happened to Boeing? Were they held accountable?
They faced consequences, but some would say not enough. The 737 MAX 8 was grounded worldwide. Boeing was fined billions, hit with lawsuits from the families. Their reputation, their stock price, it all took a hit.
Big consequences, but did anyone face criminal charges?
No. And that's a point of debate. Some people argue that fines, lawsuits, they're not enough. That individuals within Boeing should have been held criminally responsible.
It's a tough question. No easy answer. But it makes you think about corporate accountability, how to prevent something like this from happening again.
Right. This crash, it's a reminder. Even in a highly regulated industry like aviation, things can go terribly wrong. When profit comes before safety, when warnings are ignored, when oversight fails.
It's a story that makes us look at the systems we trust, the people who design them, operate them.
And ask tough questions. Demand transparency. Fight for a culture of safety, where human life is always the priority.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep learning about this story. The resources are in our show notes. And as you go about your day, remember those lessons we talked about. Speak up if you see something wrong, challenge the way things are done, never stop fighting for a world where safety and doing the right thing, they're not optional.